Okay, so I want to thank all of you for joining us. I'm really lucky to have UNT County put together this livestock knowledge series. I think it's awesome that UNT County is doing this for the youth, and it's also available to youth across different counties on the state. So that's awesome. So, like it's been mentioned, I'm going to be talking about steers tonight, showing steers. And I titled my presentation Back to Basics because I believe even the most advanced showman is if you master the basics, you will do really well showing steers. And so tonight I am going to talk about the basics. I'm sure I could talk about so many more things, but for the sake of this meeting, just the basics. I also want to let you guys know that I want you guys to ask questions. So if you have questions, unmute yourself. You can interrupt me. That's okay. I'd love to answer any questions that you have. If you need any clarification as I'm going through slides, just let me know. You can also drop something in the chat and I'll try to keep an eye on the chat as well. So, like I said, I want questions and hopefully I can give you answers. So before we begin, I wanted to introduce myself because I feel like this is the type of person I am. I like to know the type of person that's giving me information. So I just want to verify to you guys that I do know a little bit about steers. So I grew up in Randolph, Utah. That's in Rich County. If you guys don't know, Randolph is in a county that's considered like the coldest in Utah. A couple weeks ago, we had 40 below weather. So we get really cold here. And I grew up on a cattle ranch with my parents and my sister. We did a lot with raising cattle. We rode horses, all the works. And so with that, I got to pick a steer out of the herd every year, and I got to show steers. So I participated in 4-H for 10 years. I showed steers all of 10 years that I could. And I also dabbled in horsemanship a little bit, but showing steers is definitely my favorite. And it was especially fun to do it with my sisters. It was definitely a family affair. When you have steers, everyone's involved, I feel like. So because I was so involved with 4-H, I wanted to get a degree in animal science. So I went to Utah State University where I got a bachelor's in animal science, and then I went on to get my master's degree in animal nutrition. After I graduated with that, I worked at Utah State for a few years as a lab technician, got to work on various research projects regarding nutrition and animal performance. And then that led me to come back to my roots in Rich County, and now I'm the Rich County Extension faculty, also known as Rich County Extension agent. So that's why I'm here tonight. I'm super glad that UNT County invited me again. Um, so an overview of the presentation, some of the things I'm going to talk about tonight is selection of your animal. So I know with steers, we're kind of late in the game with selection. We should have our animals all ready, especially you kids in UNT County. You should have your animals all ready to go since your show's in a couple months. I'm going to talk about nutrition because that is heavy on my background is nutrition. I love talking about nutrition. And then practicing with your steer, we'll touch a little bit on that. And then also Cheyenne asked me to talk briefly about meat basics with beef. So I will talk about that. And I will mention again, if you have any questions, just feel free to interrupt. So the first thing with selection. So I know this is over Zoom, but I want to make sure it's, I don't know, we can ask questions and you guys can give me answers. So I'm going to ask you a question. Feel free to put it in the chat or unmute yourself and just blurt it out. So with selection, that is one of the first steps to success with showing steers is selecting the right steer. So what are some things you look for when selecting your steer?
What about like confirmation?
That is great, Colette. I'll talk a little bit about that. Does anyone else have any ideas of what you look for when you're selecting your steer? Oh, we have one in the chat. Weight. Weight's a good one. Anything else? Josie Batty, do you want to, you raised your hand. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah. The health of the animal.
The health of the animal. That's good. We want to start out with a healthy animal. And then Gunnar Jackson. Sorry, Heather. I know his mom. Heather said how he stands. So I'm going to say Gunnar said that. So those are all really great things. So for the sake of, oh, wrong way. For the sake of this meeting, I'm just going to talk about three things: muscle, structural soundness. So a few of you alluded to structural soundness, conformation, how they stand, structural soundness, and then I just lumped the third into like style, balance, eye appeal, how they look. So I'm going to talk about each of these individually so you know a little bit more. Why is muscle so important when we're showing steers? And you don't have to answer this, I'll answer it for you. The reason why muscle is so important when you're choosing steers is because they're a market animal. And at the end of the day, these animals end up in someone's freezer. And so meat is muscle. Muscle is meat. So that's why muscling is so important, is because it is a product that we are selling. And so how do we tell if a calf has indication of muscling? Now, it might be a little bit hard when you're picking your calf because they're younger, but we can still look at a few things to know, okay, this calf is going to have muscling. And so those are width, depth, and shape. So when you look at width, if you look at the steer on the left, you can see from stifle to stifle, that's what this arrow that says 2 on it, that's stifle to stifle. If your steer is wide from stifle to stifle compared to other steers, that means, okay, this steer is going to have some muscling. Another thing you can look at is from the width of their hips. If they have like a wide set, you know they're going to have a lot of muscling. And then if you look again at the picture on the left, the arrows that say 4, how wide does your steer stand? If they naturally stand wide, that means they're going to have a lot of muscling. But if they naturally stand narrow, maybe they'll be a little bit like lighter muscled. And so when you're picking out your calf, you can look at how wide they stand, how wide their butt is, just really how wide their chest is, and that'll give you an idea of how much muscling this calf will have. The second thing you can look at is depth. So looking at the side, this is where you can look at this picture on the right and this line that says 3. Look at their depth of body. Is this calf really deep or is he really shallow? Because if they're really deep, then that's an indication of muscling. And so just really look at your calf. Are they wide? Are they deep? The next thing you can look at is shape. And this might be a little bit harder in younger calves, but you definitely start to see it as the calves start to get older, is the shape of the muscle. Is there some roundness to their butt? That's an indication of muscling. Is there some roundness to their shoulder, to their forearm, to their back leg? Do they have shape to it? So that shape means they have muscle. If you have a steer that has a butt that looks like a pancake, of course they're not going to have a lot of muscling. So that's something that you can look at, especially when they're young. These are some indicators of muscle. Okay, the next thing, which I think is really, really important, is structural soundness. Why is structural soundness so important in calves? Because I get sometimes people say, well, we just end up eating them, so why do they have to walk? Well, they need to walk because they need to gain weight. In a feedlot setting, calves need to be structurally sound and able to make it to the feed bunk in order to make it to get a drink of water, in order to travel. So structural soundness is still really important even in our market steers. And I will say this, we're not talking about breeding livestock, but structural soundness is very, very, very important in our breeding livestock, in our bulls and heifers, but it's still important for our steers. So when you're looking at structural soundness in our steers, there's a few things you can look at. And for this presentation, I'm just going to talk about legs. So if you look at the picture on the left on the bottom, you can look at like their leg set. And so here this bull has a correct set for his legs. So he's not too sickle hocked and he's not too post-legged. He has the right amount of set in his hock, so he still has some bend in his hock, and he has some angle to his pastern, and that pastern is down here. And so he has a nice set to his set of his leg. So he'll be able to walk really well. He'll be able to cover his tracks. And what I mean by that is when you watch a cow walk or a steer walk, their back feet is able to cover where their front feet were as they walk. So that's covering their tracks. This middle bull is what's called post-legged. So his hock is pretty straight. He has his pasterns really set high. It's pretty steep. And so that's when you get post-legged animals. And so if you watch them walk, they don't cover their tracks. They're pretty shallow in how they walk. And then the other extreme is called sickle hocked. So they have a lot of set to their hock. They have a lot of angle to their hock, and they have a lot of set in their pastern. So their pastern is their slope is pretty low. And so you can get structural issues when you have sickle hocked and post-legged animals. So that's something you can really look at when you're looking at calves to select for your steers. You can see their legs when they're young. You can see how they're built. This is something that's really important to look at. Now, when you're looking from the front, you can have normal straight legs, or you can have knock-kneed when the knees are bowing in, or bow-legged, the knees are bowing out. And then you can have, looking from the back, normal, so their legs are straight, bow-legged, or cow-hocked. And so we really just want our calves to have nice straight legs, like looking from the front and the back. And then we want them in their back legs to have a nice set to their hock, not too angled, not too post-legged, just a nice like in between set. And you also want the pastern bone to have the correct set to it. And the reason why this is important, because as calves start to put on lots of weight, it puts a lot of pressure on their joints. It puts a lot of pressure on their legs. So in order for them to travel correctly, in order for them to do well, they need to have the correct structural soundness. Josie, do you have a question, or is that just your hand raised from when you answered that question before?
I think it was my hand raised from answering that other question.
Okay, perfect. I just wanted to make sure. So structural soundness is super important. I just want to emphasize that. Also, like I said, I'm just talking about legs in this presentation, but you can get pretty nitty-gritty into structural soundness. You can go into the set of their hip, you can get into their shoulder, how their neck is incorporated into their body, the straightness of their back, all of that is structural soundness. But for the sake of this presentation, looking at legs is an easy place to start because, again, like I said, when you're looking at calves in the fall to pick for your project, you can look at legs really easy. Okay, the last thing with selection is eye appeal. And the reason why I say this is because you can have a steer with really good muscling. You can have a steer that's perfectly structurally correct. But at the end of the day, judges like to look at good cattle. So can you guys tell me what's something that brings eye appeal to steers? What's a trait that brings eye appeal? You guys have any idea? Eye appeal. What makes a steer look good? Colette said color. Yeah, sometimes with show steers, we can get pretty fancy with color, can't we? Does anyone have any other ideas? No? Okay, that's okay. So what I mean by eye appeal, there's a few different things. Is you can talk about uniform body depth. So if we look at the steer on the right, this is what's called an unbalanced steer. So, oh, there's a few more. Straight back, that's great. The coat, perfect. So these are all things that that go into eye appeal. So when I say uniform body depth, this steer has a nice deep girth, heart girth. So that's, if you can see my pointer, that's where I'm looking at. But he's a little bit shallow in his flank. So he doesn't have uniform body depth. This picture of the steer on the left, that's what they call the ideal steer, if you want to call it that. Another thing that brings eye appeal is a nice clean front. So this steer on the right, he's pretty heavy fronted. So he has a lot of loose skin in his brisket and his neck area. That doesn't bring eye appeal. It's kind of, they call that a wasty front. It's a little bit sloppy. The next thing is a smooth shoulder. Sometimes with the steers, if you have some structural issues or you have a lot of muscling, you can kind of get a coarse shoulder. You want a nice, smooth shoulder, nice to look at. Someone did say this, a straight back, that's really great for eye appeal. You want a nice level back. Some steers, they start to dip behind their shoulders. That's a structural issue, but it can also decrease eye appeal. You want a level hip, so you don't want the steer to kind of slope off at their butt. You want them to have a nice level hip. That brings eye appeal. And you also want them to be proportionate. So this steer on the right, he's pretty heavy fronted, but he's pretty light in his rear end. You want the steer to be proportionate between the front and the back. So you want steers that have balanced front, balanced back. And so these are some things you can look at. Another few things that I didn't mention is your steer long bodied. That's something that brings eye appeal. And then some things that maybe are a little bit flashier that you guys alluded to. You can have flashy calves that have color, but you can also have really bad steers that have fancy color. So coloring is just a little extra thing added. So those are a few things. Okay, before we move into talking about nutrition, I wanted to talk about genetic potential because this is kind of a tie-in between selection and nutrition. You can only feed a calf to its genetic potential. Nutrition cannot fix bad genetics. So if you have a steer that's just not great genetically and you're feeding them a magical feed, if it's even exists, that steer will not do well compared to a steer that's put together well genetically. So you cannot feed a steer to success if it's just not put together, if it has light muscling, if it has bad structure. Even if you feed that steer the best you can possibly can, it won't work out. On the flip side, just because you have a really good calf genetically doesn't mean you'll automatically win. You really need to make sure you feed your animals right. So it's kind of you got to make sure you put time into selection, make sure you pick a good calf, and you have to feed it good. One or the other won't let you win. You got to do both. Does that make sense? Okay. So this is an example. In this picture, the steer on the right, look at his hocks. He has terrible sickle hocks. He has a pancake butt. Do you think that if we fed this calf the best that we can, that he would beat this calf on the left? I don't think so, because this calf definitely has better structure, and you can tell he has better muscling. So I just wanted to let you guys know that. Yeah, he does look scrawny. So just need to make sure we take time picking our calves, and we need to make sure we feed them good too. Okay, with nutrition, all mammals have 6 nutritional requirements. Can you guys name them off for me? You guys can just name them out or chat. Okay. Water. Water's really good. That's one.
Protein.
Protein. That's another one. Mineral. Someone in the chat said mineral. That's another one. 3 more. You guys are doing good. Fat. Fat is another one. Forage, that's kind of one for ruminants. Exercise, that's not a nutrition requirement, but exercise is good. So I'll show you guys. So the 6 nutritional requirements for animals are water, carbohydrates. So roughages can be your carbohydrates. That's a form of carbohydrate. Protein, fats, vitamins, and minerals. Okay, with water. Water is overlooked, but it is one of the most important, I shouldn't say it isn't one, it is the most important nutrient for your animals. Your steer needs nice, clean water in order to gain. If they don't have good water, they'll start to decrease their intake, which means they won't gain as much. They also need clean water. I don't know what it was, but when I was showing steers, I had a steer that was notorious for pooping in the water trough. Can you believe that? And so I would have to dump the water trough, clean out the trough, and put in clean water. So it's really important to make sure your animals have clean water. The second one is carbohydrates. So if you look at nutrient requirements for cattle, usually this is what's called energy. Energy, carbohydrates, kind of the same thing. So carbohydrates give a lot of energy to your steers. And that's really important for them to gain weight. So some carbohydrates that your steers might be eating would be corn, oats, barley, any type of grain. Protein's also really important. Protein helps build their frame, helps them build muscle. And so that's important in their diet. So some popular forms of protein in a steer's diet would be soybean meal. You can feed alfalfa, distillers grains. Those are all sources of protein. Fat is another great one. So fat has a lot of energy in it, but it's really important. You should only have 5 to 6% of fat in a ration for a steer. So some forms of fats would be any like oilseed grains that contains fats, and then you have your vitamins and minerals. So those are just required in just a little bit amounts, but they're still really important for the steer to perform biological processes. So with the vitamins, just a fun fact. So steers are ruminants. I hope you guys know that. That means they have a 4-chambered stomach. So the rumen synthesizes vitamin B and vitamin K. So all the other vitamins we probably should be feeding to our steers. And then minerals, we should be giving our steers some mineral, whether it's a loose mineral block, we really need to be giving our steers some minerals. Just to point out something, if you guys are going to a feed mill and buying what's called a complete feed, so if you go to a feed mill and say, okay, I want your show steer feed, and they'll give you a bag of show steer feed, that's usually what's called a complete feed. And so these feed mills have nutritionists that know all the requirements for the steers, and they'll formulate the feeds to have the right amount of each nutrient in the feeds. So if you're going to a feed mill, getting a show steer feed, you should be good with all these nutrients. That's all accounted for in that feed. But I would also include either a mineral block or loose mineral with your steers as well. Okay, so I'm gonna leave you with 4 nutrition tips. Like I said, water is the most important nutrient. And it's so important, if you'll notice, when you guys go to fair, sometimes steers will go off water because they go to fair and they have new water from what they're used to. So they'll go off water and they'll start to lose weight. So it's really important before fair, if you want to get your steer to drink good, feed them out of the bucket that you're going to be letting them drink in at fair or any show that you're going to. I know some people mix some things in with their water to kind of get the steer used to flavored water. So I know in the past, some people have mixed Kool-Aid or like Gatorade in with their water to get the steer to drink a flavored water. And then they mix that Gatorade in at fair. So their steer is used to that flavor. So then they drink water at home versus fair. For my sister and I, we grew up on a place that had well water. And then when we went into town, it wasn't well water. So our steers did terrible at drinking at fair. So we just made sure that they're used to drinking out of a different bucket than their water trough. And then we also would start giving them the town water. We'd go get some and we'd start giving some town water so they'd get used to that different taste. So water is really important, and it can really make or break you in terms of gaining. And so make sure your steer has clean water, and that's just a few tips before fair if you want your steer to drink well at fair. Number 2, someone said roughage as a nutrient requirement. So although it's not one of the 6, it's really important for steers because, like I said, they're ruminants. So with the rumen, they need roughage, they need long fibers in order to keep their rumen healthy. So along with your complete feed, if you're feeding them grain, you really need to be giving your steers hay, and grass hay is probably the best type of hay you can be giving your steers just to keep that rumen healthy. Number 3, be consistent with your feeding routines. Cattle are creatures of habit. So it's crazy. So in the feedlot, when these feedlots feed these steers, they usually feed them at the same time every day. These steers are such creatures of habits that they will go to the same bunk space every day because they're just so used to routine. So our show steers are the same way. It's really important that we pick a time that works best for us and the steers and feed them every morning and night. I think it's great to feed them 2 times a day. Feed them the same time every morning, feed them the same time every night. As it gets warmer, it's probably smart to start feeding them earlier in the morning when it's cool, and then when it starts to cool off at night, because when it's really, really hot, I don't like to eat. So your steer's probably the same way. They'll eat better if you feed them when it's cooler. And number 4, keep things simple. That's really, really important. Nutrition does not have to be overly complicated. I think it can really get in the weeds with some of these nutritional supplements that companies are selling. And although I think some of them have their places, I think it's really important to keep it simple. Pick a feed that works for you and your steer and stick to it. And just really, again, just keep it simple because it'll just make your life a lot easier and it'll be less stress on your steer. Okay, another thing that I wanted to talk about is we talked about the nutrients that are required. So I want to talk a little bit about your carbohydrates, I'll call it energy for this slide, and then your protein. So steers have what's called a growth curve. So at the beginning of their life, they grow really fast. They gain a lot of weight because their bones are growing, they're growing taller, they're putting a lot of muscle. And then as they start to get closer to finishing, when they're really fat, their weight will start to level off. And this is what's called a growth curve. So this graph is basically showing the growth curve, and then it also illustrates that steers with different frame sizes have different growth curves. So like a steer that's maybe really tall might take longer to finish than a steer that's really short. That's basically what this graph is showing. But what I want to point out is that there's a phase when the steer's putting on muscle, and then there's a phase when the steer's putting on fat. Now, in this graph on the right, you can see that there's different requirements for each phase. So as the steer gets heavier from weight 770 to 1100 pounds, you can see that the protein requirements for the steer decreases because the steer is putting less and less muscle onto its body, and the energy stays the same throughout. So if you're feeding a feed from a feed mill, some feed mills offer a program. So some feeds have a grower feed and a finisher feed. That's a really great tool because, like I said, these feed mills have these nutritionists, and they've already accounted for these different nutritional requirements at these different stages. So when your steer's growing, you want to make sure you're giving them enough protein. But as they start to finish, you don't need as much protein. You can give them more energy. And so that's a tool you can use if your feed mill has these different stages of feed. So utilize that. Okay, now practicing with your steer. I think we could have a whole workshop, a whole clinic on just working your steer, fitting your steer, how to halt or break them, all the things. Well, guess what? I only have one slide in my presentation, but I'm going to give you some tips, okay? So when you get your steer, I hope you guys have already started working with your steers. and tried to put a halter on them or already have them halter broke, because that's the sooner you do it, the easier it is. So get your steer halter broke and then just start leading your steer. Let the steer get used to you. You get used to your steer. Tie the steer up. Let them get used to being tied up. Practice setting up your steer. So we all know that when we show our steers, they need to be set up in a certain way. Now, I won't go into detail on this, but I'll give you a few pointers. But just practice setting your steer up. I had someone tell me a really great advice. So when you set up your steer, have a friend, your mom, dad, leader, take pictures or videos of you setting up your steer. So then you know how it feels when you get your steer set up correctly. Because sometimes the steer is really big. It's hard to see around them. So if you kind of video yourself, watch what you're doing, watch what your steer's doing, you have an idea of what it feels like when it's correct. I hope that makes sense. Practice using your strow stick and your Scotch comb. Just really practice. I remember I'd get so annoyed because my parents would be the judges and my sister and I would lead our steers around our pen at home. And sometimes it got kind of heated because my parents would give me advice that I didn't want to hear, but it was really good for my showmanship skills. Practice fitting your steer. That's great to do at home. Bath your steer, blow your steer off, fit them. And then another thing with showmanship is you can practice or research the questions that the judge may ask you at the show. So I know that was really vague with showing your steer. And the reason why is because I think they're better resources than a meeting over Zoom to really practice showing your animal. And that would first go to in-person clinics that your county hosts. That'd be great because you can get in-person interactions. A lot of the times they let you bring your animal, so that's great to get just in-person practice with your animal. And that's usually set up through the extension office to the 4-H kids. Your junior livestock committee members usually have an idea of what's going on. Ask them any questions. They can point you in the right direction. Leaders are a great place to ask questions too. But another thing is YouTube. I've always said you can learn anything with a Google search bar. If you want videos of how to set your steer up, videos of how to fit, videos really about anything, I'm sure it's on the internet and you can YouTube it. There's some really great fitters and showers who create videos. You can find that on YouTube and watch examples of how you should set up your steer, how you should be fitting your steer. So these are some just resources that you can use. But at the end of the day, if you're not practicing at home, then you won't be prepared for fair. And if you show up to the fair unprepared, then everyone will know that you're unprepared. So just take time to practice with your steer, because steers are big animals and they need to be practiced with. So, like I said, reach out to others if you need help with that. Okay, so the last thing I was going to talk about is just the meat basics of beef. So I was going to talk about cuts of meat and also grading beef, because at the end of the day, our show steers will end up in someone's freezer, just like I said. So it's really important that we're raising a product that is an enjoyable eating experience for the consumers. So when a steer is harvested, they're cut up into some different ways. So usually what they'll do is the carcass is halved. So they'll cut them from down the spine and the carcass is halved, and then they'll quarter them. So they'll usually quarter them about halfway. And so that's where you get the terms quarters of beef and half of beef. So after that, then the steer is broken up into primals. And that's what I have here is this picture. So these are 9. Sometimes people say there's 9, some people say there's 8. But for here, there's 9 primals that the carcass is broken up to. So you have the chuck, the brisket, the rib, the plate, loin, sirloin, flank, round, and then the shank, which would be the legs. So in each of these primals, you have your different cuts of beef. So in the chuck, we have a lot of roasts. So we can have a chuck roast, we can have the flat iron steak, 7-bone chuck roast, and the 7-bone, it just has a little bone that looks like a 7. With the brisket's becoming a lot more popular. You can have either the whole brisket or you can have the brisket flat or brisket point. And there's also a thing called beef bacon that comes from the brisket. Then you can have the ribs, so that's where your prime rib comes from. Your steaks, like your ribeye steak, plate, you get your skirt steak from there. So if you go to Mexican place and get fajitas, that's usually skirt steak or also flank steak. Loin is where you get a lot of your steaks. So you can have the T-bone, porterhouse, also the filet mignon. And then sirloin, you have the sirloin steak and tri-tip roast. Flank, again, that's kind of where your fajita meat comes from. Round is where a lot of roasts come from. So you can have your rump roast, top round roast, and then shank, you can just cut those and put them into stew. And so they're called shank center cut. So I'm going to quiz you guys a little bit. Do you guys know, let's see, I have something in this chat. Oh, everyone says you're making me hungry. Okay, do you guys know where the most tender cut of meat is, or what it is?
The tenderloin.
The tenderloin. Do you know, so it is the tenderloin, you're correct, but the filet mignon comes from the tenderloin. So if you go to a restaurant and order a filet mignon, it's supposed to be really tender. Do you know what the second most tender cut of meat is? No? Colette, you look like you know. Oh, you're muted.
Oh, you might have to ask her to unmute you. I'm not sure.
Oh. Let's see. So, let's see. So the second most tender cut of meat is actually the flat iron steaks. That comes from the chuck. All right, I'm going to ask you a few more questions. What part of the carcass has the most muscles? Tri-tip, the round. So it's actually the chuck. The chuck has a lot of muscles because if you think about it, that's kind of where the shoulder is. So there's a lot of muscles protecting that shoulder. Okay, what part of the carcass is the most lean? The sirloin, that's good. You guys are close. The loin. So the most lean is actually the round. And so I actually learned this when I was showing steers. So, and I can't tell you exactly, like I can't back this with scientific evidence, but usually a steer will finish, meaning they'll put down fat from the front to the back. So before a steer gets really fat in his hind end, he'll start to get fatter in the front end. So sometimes as your steer's nearing that finishing phase, he'll look a little bit unproportionate where his front end's pretty fatty, but his back end's not as fat. And it also has to do with like what the muscles are doing as well. So if you think about it, the back legs, they're doing a lot of walking, so they would be a little bit more lean than the front. And so there's some cuts of meat quiz for you. So really, beef is really cool. We get a lot of awesome cuts of meat from our animals. So just keep that in mind as you're raising your steers, that it's going to end up in someone's freezer and someone's really going to enjoy your steer. I know that might make some of you sad, but I'm sorry, that's what happens. Okay, so in the industry, once steers are harvested, they usually are graded. And so there's two types of grades. You can get quality grade and yield grade. With quality grade, usually graders look mostly at marbling, but they also look at carcass maturity, lean maturity, and firmness. So what this means is they'll look at marbling. The more marbling, the better. So that's what you can see is here you have USDA Select, Choice, and Prime. Prime has more marbling, which is fat in the meat. That gives more flavor. So more marbling, the better with quality grade. But with the maturity aspect of it, an old cow that someone sends to the auction house cannot grade USDA prime because they're too old. So usually they'll grade either commercial cutter or canner. And so only young animals get to be graded select, choice, and prime and standard. And so just keep that in mind. That's how quality grade works. With yield grade, they look at all sorts of things. So they look at back fat thickness, kidney, pelvic, and heart fat. So how fat the inside of the animal was. They also look at ribeye area. So how big the muscle is at that ribeye. And then they'll also look at heart carcass weight. So when they look at all of these things, they put them into a fancy formula and they get yield grade. So with yield grade, the lower the number, the better. And what that means is, so you can see here, you have USDA yield grade 1 through 5, and you can see the difference between USDA yield grade 1 and 5. 1 has a lot less back fat than 5. Can you see that huge sliver of back fat on USDA 5? So
Yep.
at USDA, oh, was someone going to say something? No? Okay. So what USDA yield grade is basically saying is, okay, this steer has the most product, the most muscle, the most meat that you can sell. And there's not a lot of fat, because if a steer has a lot of fat, the harvesting facility is going to have to cut out off that fat because you can't sell that to a consumer. So they have USDA yield grade 1 has the most product to sell to a consumer. So why is this important? Why is grading meat important? And the reason why it's important is because producers are paid on the grid system. So this just shows the quality grade. So you have prime, certified Angus beef, and then choice, select, standard, and then your yield grades. So if you have a prime quality grade with a yield grade 1, the producer is going to get a really good premium. On the other hand, if you have a standard quality grade with yield grade 5, they're actually going to get a reduction in what they get paid. And then this is just for fun. Certified Angus beef, they get a premium. And so, fun fact though, with certified Angus beef, for a steer or animal to be certified Angus beef, their hide just has to be a certain percentage black. So technically, if you had a Holstein come through that was majority black, they could be certified Angus beef. That's why you're seeing a lot of breeds breed their animals to have black hides. So that's just a fun fact for you. Nothing against Angus beef, but if they're certified Angus beef, they might not be Angus. So based on the grid system, what type of beef should producers be raising? And I'm going to ask you guys that question.
Could you repeat the question?
Yes. Based on this graph, so based on the quality grade and yield grade, what type of beef should producers be raising? So someone said prime 1. So that's right, they get a premium if they grade quality grade prime and yield grade 1. But what type of animal is that? Yeah, they grade that. But are they super, super fat? Or are they lean? That's kind of what I'm getting at.
Takes too long.
They are super, super fat.
So if they're really, really fat, they'd have a high yield grade, and we don't want that. So what we want,
No, not that.
no, we don't want fat. So we want steers that have a genetic predisposition to have a lot of marbling. So they have a lot of marbling, but they're not really fat. They're able to have a lower yield grade. And so that's the type of cattle that producers will get a premium on. That might be hard, but that's the industry, what producers are getting paid for. That's the type of animals that we're trying to produce. So that's my spill on the grid system. And also the meat basics. So with the takeaways of this presentation for selection, we just want to make sure we select animals that are structurally sound and look for potential in muscling and that are easier on the eye. With nutrition, we want to make sure we keep it simple. We don't need to overcomplicate things. Make sure our steer always has clean water. Keep to a schedule because steers are creatures of habit. And research feeds, talk to feed mills, and just stick with one that works best for you and your steer. Practice, practice, practice with your steer. Ask for help. If you're looking for information, just ask, look. That's the best way to get information, is just look for it. So look for opportunities to learn new things. And then with meat basics, our steers are raised for human consumption, so keep that in mind. Beef is graded based on quality and yield. An ideal beef has good marbling and a good yield grade. So those are my takeaways from my presentation. And with that, if you guys have any questions, now would be the time to ask me. But if you want, I left my email right here, and you guys can email me or call me, and that's my cell phone. No questions? Okay, you guys are an easy group. Oh, someone raised their hand. Josie, do you have a question?
Yes.
Okay, what's your question?
What kind of cow are the judges looking for?
So the judges are looking for steers that have a lot of muscling, because that means they have a lot of meat, a lot of product. They're looking for steers that are able to walk well, steers that are structurally sound, like I talked about. And they're also looking for steers that have eye appeal, steers that have a clean front, have a long back, a long straight back, are smooth, their muscles are smooth, they're not too coarse, they have a deep body, deep girth, deep flank. Their bone they have like thicker legs that shows good structure. So those are just a few things that the judges are looking for when they're judging their animals. Okay, someone else raised their hand.
What if your steer gets injured?
Okay, so if your steer gets injured, it depends on the severity of the injury. It's crazy because in our county, we've had a few kids that have steers with broken legs. And once the steer breaks its legs, there's no going back. You probably need to euthanize your steer. But if your steer gets injured, talk to your vet. Just watch your steer. If there's any treatments that you can do, for sure, use the treatments. But just remember, as you get closer to the fair, some drugs or some medicines that we use for our steers, we maybe won't be able to use because we need to have a withdrawal before they get harvested. So some medicines we can't use a certain amount of days before they get harvested, because then it can get into the meat. So I'd say talk to your vet. If your steer gets injured, talk to your vet.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
We've got a Zoom user who raised their hand.
I think that was the last question.
Oh, sorry.
No, you're okay. Okay. Well, like I said, if you have any questions, oh, maybe we have one more chat. No, never mind. If you have any questions that you think of later, please feel free to email me or give me a call, and I'd love to chat with you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Reganne. If you guys could all thank Reganne, and I think we're done. Have a good night.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
We really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.